we have entitled Psalm 63, "It is well with my soul." It is well with my soul. As you read through this psalm, you'll find that David's soul was thirsty, and David's soul was troubled, and David's soul was tired. However, it was still well with David's soul. In spite of all of those things, it was well with David's soul. Because as we take a look at what this psalm teaches us, it was well with David's soul because his soul was satisfied. That's the first 5 verses of this psalm. The next 2 verses point out the fact that his soul was sheltered. And then the final verses of this psalm point out the fact that his soul was supported. And we want to consider each of these things, that it might be well with our soul also. There are many beautiful songs in our songbooks, but I think most of us would agree that this is the one of the most beautiful songs in the book. It's a rather slow song. It isn't a fast song, and so we may not necessarily like the speed of it, but we do like the words of it, and we like the comfort that it gives to us. And I think if we could want any song to be true of our lives, this is a song that we would want to be true of our lives. We would want it to be well with our souls. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. My sin, oh the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, O my soul. And Lord, haste the day when my faith shall be sight. The clouds be rolled back as a scroll. The trump shall resound, and the Lord shall descend. Even so, it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. Now, it's hard to read it because we want to sing it, because it's a beautiful song, and it flows hopefully off of our lips as we do so. There is a passage in Isaiah 32 in verse 2, which I think captures maybe what this psalm is trying to say, and what David found in God that allowed his soul to be well. It says in Isaiah 32 and verse 2, and by the way, this is a messianic prophecy. It's a prophecy concerning the kingdom and what it's going to be like in the kingdom of our Lord. And of course, we dwell within that kingdom tonight. And so it says, and a man shall be as an hiding place from the wind, and a covert from the tempest, as rivers of water in a dry place, as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. Beautiful pictures that are painted here. A hiding place from the wind. We had some pretty strong winds this last weekend. Many of us sought out a hiding place from those winds, a place where we felt safe from those winds, a place that was a covering from the tempest. Think about rivers of water in a dry place. What a peaceful, wonderful scene that is. And then the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. And if you think about the country that we're talking about, and you think about the Middle East, and you think about Palestine, and you think about that area, if you're in the wilderness, out in the desert, about the only place that you can hope to find any shade is in the shade of a great rock. You can get just on the right side of that rock, it'll block the sun, and you can get in the shade. And in the shade, it's several degrees cooler than it is in the sun. And there you can rest, and it can be well with your soul. And that's what's being pictured here in this psalm. Now, as we talk about this, we pointed out that there are 3 reasons why it was well with his soul. First of all, it was well with his soul because his soul was satisfied. His soul had everything it needed to be satisfied. God was providing for his every need. If you'll notice in Psalm 63, in verses 1 through 5, it says, O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee. My flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is, to see thy power and thy glory, so as I have seen Thee in the sanctuary. Because Thy loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise Thee. Thus will I bless Thee while I live. I will lift up my hands in Thy name. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth shall praise Thee with joyful lips. Notice especially verse 5 there, where he says, my soul shall be satisfied. His soul is thirsty in verse 1. It is satisfied in verse 5. It's well with his soul because God is satisfying his soul. God is giving his soul what is needed to be satisfied, to be happy. Now, as we think about this passage, we need to see the scenery. And that is that David is fleeing from Jerusalem. He's fleeing to the south. He's going through the desert. He's going through the wilderness. Now, this area is an extremely arid area. It is an area where the earth is cracked because of a lack of water. Literally, he says, where no water is. It's a parched land. And as David is running and David's crossing this arid climate, in this parched land, David says, that's a picture of my soul. This earth is crying out, David says, for water. It's parched. It needs water. And David says, just as this earth needs water, I need God. I need God to satisfy my soul. I am thirsty for God. And again, the language here is with the ETH, which is so beautiful in the King James Version. On thirsteth and on longeth suggests a continuing thirst, a continuing longing. It isn't something that spikes at one minute and goes away the next. No, it's a continual thing in David's heart, that he's longing, he's thirsty, he's hungry for God. Now, Psalm 143 and verse 6 is another passage that pictures this. There are several that do. This is one of David's favorite images when he talks about his hunger or thirst for God. He does one time describe himself as a hart, as a deer that's panting for the water brooks. But more often he'll compare himself to the parched earth and how much it needs water. It says in Psalm 143 and verse 6, I stretch forth my hands unto Thee. My soul thirsteth after Thee as a thirsty land. That thirsty land pictured David. Psalm 84 and verse 2, if you'll turn back, going back in the direction of where we are, Psalm 84 and verse 2, you'll see again another image of being thirsty for God. My soul longeth, yea, even fainteth, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God. This is the idea of thirsteth in this passage. The word that is translated as fainteth is the same word, same concept. And so the soul is longing, the soul is fainting, the soul is thirsting for God. And notice in this passage it says, for the courts of the Lord, literally to be among God's people and to be in the house of the Lord. Now, if you go back to the psalm that we're studying in Psalm 63, you'll see that he references the same thing. It isn't in the same verse, but in the very next verse, notice what he says, to see Thy power and Thy glory, so as I have seen Thee in the sanctuary. And so in thirsting and longing for God, he's thirsty and longing for the opportunity to be in worship to God. David, when he was separated from Jerusalem, was separated from the place of worship. It did not mean that he could not worship God. His heart certainly was turned in devotion to God. And we see David crying out to God. We see that throughout the Psalms. And so we know David was doing that. But the corporate place of worship, he was removed from that. And on this occasion, he was removed from it because he had no choice. Because of Absalom's rebellion and having been driven from the city, and David longed to be back there. He was thirsty and hungry to be back there where he could worship God and be among God's people in doing that. You know, because David hungered and thirsted for God, he was filled. Remember Jesus in laying out the principles of His kingdom, in Matthew chapter 5 through 7, we called it the Sermon on the Mount. He said, blessed are they that do hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall what? they shall be filled. If you want to be filled, you have to hunger and thirst for righteousness. That's the same as David is saying here, hungering and thirsting for God. And David did that, and as a result, he was filled. His soul was satisfied. Now, there are a number of things in Psalm 63 and verse 1 that show us how much David is thirsty and longing for God. One is the image that he uses of the parched earth, and the earth just waiting for a rain so that it can soak that rain up. But notice he also says, O God, Thou art my God, early will I seek Thee. Early will I seek Thee. Now, there are two different implications of this word early. One is the hour of the day. Early, first thing, David says, I seek You. That's how I start my day, David says. I start my day seeking You. That's the most important item on the agenda. That's the most important order of business as the day starts, is to seek You. How do you start your day? You say, well, I start my day with a cup of coffee. Okay. Or I start my day with a bowl of cereal. Okay. Or I start my day with a shower. Okay. You think David's approach to starting the day is a pretty good day? Starting your day by seeking God, by saying a quick prayer even before you begin the activities of the day, getting ready for what the day has ahead, preparing for that. There are a number of ways, and I'm not saying that it necessarily has to be the very first thing you do even before you drink your coffee, but it does need to be that which is a part of that morning ritual that you do every day. It needs to be a part of that. It doesn't need to be left out of that. It needs to be something that you do before you head out and you begin your day, that you take the time to do that. And David did that. Notice Psalm 5 in verse 3. Notice what he says. And I've tried to limit the passages because we just won't have time if we notice a lot of them. But Psalm 5 and verse 3 says, My voice shalt thou hear in the morning, O Lord. In the morning will I direct my prayer unto Thee, and will look up. Notice as he talks about beginning his day that way. Psalm 78 and verse 34. Psalm 78 and verse 34 is another one that I pulled out for us to look at. Psalm 78 and verse 34. When he slew them, then they sought him, and they returned and inquired early after God. And so it is, as far as the hour of the day, it has something to do with that, but it also has to do with the priority that you put on it. Matthew 6 and verse 33 tells us to seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. We very well could translate that, seek early the kingdom of God and His righteousness. That's the idea of it. It means seeking it very early, putting it first, not putting it after the other events of the day or the other things that we're doing, but giving it the priority. Proverbs chapter 1 in verses 27 and 28 is talking about wisdom, but it has a good lesson to teach us right here of how many people seek God. You know, if we were to number the people who don't seek God at all, maybe that number would be few. Most people do seek God in one way or another. They don't always seek Him correctly, and they don't always seek Him when they ought to. But notice the point of Proverbs 1, 27 and 28. It says, When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you, then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. Now notice that they wait till the problems come. And then they say, oh, we need to seek God, and we need to put Him first, and we need to seek Him early. But they wait until all the problems come before they do. What were people doing after 9/11? Record church attendance, right? Across the nation of people going back to church services. Even our legislators, hard to imagine now. I understand that the National Day of Prayer can't have that anymore because that might offend someone. So we just removed that type of thing from our even political climate. You remember what our legislators were doing after 9/11? They dared to stand on the courthouse steps and say a prayer. Imagine that. But you see, when calamity comes, when trouble comes, people look and they pray. But David wasn't doing that. David didn't wait till trouble came. No, David sought God early. He sought God before the trouble came, and he just continued to seek God even after the trouble came. This wasn't something that he took up. It was something that was already a part of who he was. Proverbs chapter 8 and verse 17. While we're in Proverbs, let's notice one more passage, then we'll go back. Proverbs 8 and verse 17 says, I love them that love me, and those that seek me early shall find me. If we want to find God, then we're going to have to seek Him early. We're going to have to make Him the priority. We're going to have to put Him first. If we do not, then we won't find Him, just as Proverbs 1:27 and 28 was saying to us. Now notice as he continues, he says in this context in verse 3, because thy loving kindness is better than life. Is that not a beautiful statement? Thy loving kindness is better than life. I would rather have your loving kindness than I would life. It's that important to me. It's that critical to my soul. My soul is thirsty for your loving kindness. It's interesting the way that the Bible describes things. It doesn't say merely that God is kind to us, but it says that He has loving kindness toward us. It combines two words, and even two words aren't adequate to describe it. But the words have to be coupled in order to try to capture how wonderful His kindness is. Loving kindness. Now the Bible does the same thing with mercy. It doesn't merely say that God is merciful toward us, but it talks about His tender mercy toward us. Mercy alone is not enough to describe it. Kindness alone isn't enough. There has to be another word added to try to capture how wonderful God's kindness, how wonderful God's mercy is. And David does that here, and he says, His loving kindness is worth more to me than what life is. David spoke of his soul as being satisfied with God in verse 5. And he says, as with marrow and fatness. Now that may not resonate with us. That may not be a description that we would use, but it literally means, and it refers to the best. God has satisfied me. He hasn't merely filled my belly. He hasn't merely filled my soul, but He has filled my soul with the best. Now there are a lot of things that you can eat and get full. They're not necessarily the best. But it's literally saying that God has filled our soul with the best. He gave us the richest delights with which we are filled. There's the picture there. I remember when I was in the school of preaching, one of my fellow students was named John Tella. And John Tella grew up in India. And John was an excellent student, and he was a very talented man. In fact, John had been almost everything. He had worked with lepers in India. He had been an artist in India. He had been a chef there. He had even been in a rock band there. He had done just about everything that a person could do. And one weekend, John came home with me, and he was going to cook for us. And he did. And he prepared curry for us. And if you know anything about India, that's a staple as far as what they eat. And it's wonderful, especially when someone knows how to prepare it. And John knew how to prepare it. It's interesting, when he cut up the chicken, he left a bone in every piece. Now, that's not the way we cut up a chicken. We try to get the bones out. But he wanted to make sure he left a piece of bone in every piece. And I'd never seen anyone cut up a chicken like that. And so I said something to him about it. And he said, oh, that's because we don't use utensils. And you got to have a way to pick it up. And so if you have a bone in every piece, then you pick it up by the bone, and then you eat the meat off the bone. And so he had learned how to cut it up so that every piece literally had a bone in it. So you could use it that way. But he prepared that. But I remember John, and being around John at various times, and there were things that John wouldn't eat, not because he thought they were wrong, but because he had never eaten them. He could not eat them in his own country because of laws and other things. And one was pork. And we were living in Memphis, Tennessee, and I said, you know, you can't live in Memphis and not eat barbecue. And John said, I can. And to my knowledge, he never ate a single bite of pork the whole time that he lived here. And I said, John, you don't think there's anything wrong with this, do you? God gave us all things to be received with thanksgiving. He said, no, there's not anything wrong with it. He said, but I can't have it in my country. And so I'm not going to eat it here. And the only thing I could figure out in my mind is he was afraid it was going to be so good that he wasn't ever going to get to have it again. And so he didn't want to start something that he wouldn't be able to finish. But I never convinced him to do that. But I remember John and maybe some of the other foreign students that we had, that when we would eat chicken, they would break the bones open. Now, the bone, as far as me, that's to be thrown away. But no, they broke the bone open. And the nutrients and all were on the inside of the bone. And that just wasn't appealing to me. But if you think about the culture that's being described right here, with marrow and fatness, you think about that image of literally everything being for your sustenance, everything being given by God to satisfy your soul. And so this is a description that would picture that for them, the marrow and the fatness. And we've gone away from fatty beef. We trim the fat off of beef and we try to remove it. But you remember that was an important part of the sacrifice under the Old Testament system. And some people in the world, the Japanese, have always had very low heart problems. They eat a lot of fish and their diet is rich in various things. And so they've avoided maybe some of the health problems that others of us have had. But their heart problems are going up. They're skyrocketing, literally, because they have caught on to American beef, and they like American beef, and they like beef as fat as it can be. They realize that's the best part. And so they've kind of taken on some of our baggage, and now it's catching up with them. But here is the fatness. And he says, God literally satisfied my soul, and He satisfied my soul with the very best. Consider a few more passages. Psalm 36 and verses 7 to 9. Psalm 36, verses 7 through 9. How excellent is Thy loving kindness, O God! Therefore the children of men put their trust under the shadow of Thy wings. They shall be abundantly satisfied with the fatness of Thy house, and Thou shalt make them drink of the river of Thy pleasures. The fatness of Thy house, literally all the things that you give them, all the good things that you provide, they'll be satisfied with them. Go to Psalm 73 and verse 25. Psalm 73 and verse 25. And notice that David continues talking about this. Now, we're talking about a king who could have anything that he wanted. And you can imagine daily on his table, there were servants who came to David and said, David, what do you want today? What can we prepare for you today? What can we fix for you today? David literally could have anything that he commanded. And here he is describing what God has done for him and all the good things that God has given to him. He says, what have I in heaven but Thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire beside Thee. If I have God, he says, I have all. I have all that I need. I have all that I want if I have God. He considered God to be the marrow and the fatness, literally the very best. Have you ever gone to someone's house and there was a lavish spread that was put out there, and maybe the host announced, now, if you leave hungry, it's your fault. You ever had anybody announce that to you? I've had it announced a number of times. But what it means is, it's all here. You eat as much as you want. You eat until you're full. You can have anything here we've got. You can have as much of it as you want to have. If you leave hungry, it's your fault. And so it is, spiritually speaking, that if our soul is not satisfied, if we leave hungry, it's our fault. Because God spreads it out before us, and God says you can have as much of it as you want. You can drink as deeply from this well as you want to. You can eat as much of this feast as you want to. It's here, it's spread before you. It's up to you now. And if you leave hungry, it is your fault. It is not God's fault. Here was David. David was in exile. He was in the wilderness. And what was David desiring more than anything else? To be in the presence of God and to be in worship of God. If you were in exile tonight, what would you be desiring more than anything else? David wasn't desiring the comforts of the palace. I'm sure it was far more comfortable than where he was. He wasn't desiring his bed back there and how comfortable it may have been. No, he was probably sleeping on the ground. He wasn't desiring that. He wasn't even desiring the companionship of friends and family, although he must have missed them much. What he was desiring more than anything else was God. If you were in exile tonight, what would you miss the most? What would you want more than anything else? Would it be the presence of God and to be able to be with God and with God's people in worship. Let's consider in the second place tonight that it was well with his soul because his soul was sheltered. Now notice he begins in verse 6, "When I remember thee upon my bed and meditate on thee in the night watches." There were 3 watches of the night. And so in these early morning hours, and again, that's something that ought to be pointed out. When he says in 63 and verse 1, "Early have I sought thee," sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we forget the next day begins after midnight. And so maybe with the way people live their lives today, they may seek God at 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, rather than at the traditional 5:30 or 6 or whatever it is that people usually get up. Things are a little different today, at least for many people today. And so we can seek God during these night watches, and that's evidently what he was doing. He's remembering God upon his bed, and probably not much of a bed if he's fleeing for his life. But in verse 7, "Because thou hast been my help, therefore in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice." He said, I'm in the shadow of your wings. I'm no longer in the palace. I'm no longer sheltered by that fortress, but I know that wherever I go, your wings are covering me, and I'm protected by that. It is interesting that when David was fleeing and running away from this city, there were those who were loyal to David, and there were those who were loyal to God. And Zadok, the priest, and Abiathar, and others among the priests were very loyal to God and very loyal to David. And when they saw David fleeing from the city, they grabbed the Ark of the Covenant and they came after David. In their minds, what more could you want than the Ark of the Covenant? You remember how important it had been to God's people in the Old Testament. And they grabbed the Ark and they were coming with David and they were bringing the Ark with them. And that's 2 Samuel 15, verses 24 through 29. But do you remember what David did? David sent them back with the Ark. It wasn't that David didn't appreciate it. He appreciated it very much. But David had a greater understanding than many did under that Old Testament system. There were those who kind of saw the Ark of the Covenant as a magic box. And as long as you had your magic box, you were okay. You couldn't lose. But David knew that it wasn't about the box. He understood that it was about the presence of God and having God with you and having God in your life and having God on your side. And so David understood, I don't have to have the magic box. It can stay in Jerusalem. Let it stay there. As long as God goes with me, I'm okay. Now there were those before David that didn't understand that, and they wanted that box with them. David had a greater understanding of God's presence than that, and I hope that we have a greater understanding of it as well. Now, this Ark of the Covenant may be what is described here when we talk about the wings and the shelter of God's wings. We've talked about before, and so we're just bringing it up this time, the cherubim on top of the Ark of the Covenant and the wings spread out over the top of it and touching. That was the mercy seat. And what David is saying is, in the shelter of those wings, in the shelter of your mercy, I'm okay, I'm protected. Or it could refer to the wings of a bird, such as the wings of a mother hen shielding her young. That's the way Jesus talked about it in Matthew 23 and verse 37. But he knew that God was sheltering him. And I want you to notice, and I've already heard the bell, 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 10. 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 10. Beautiful passage. We sometimes skip over it. Who delivered us from so great a death, and doth deliver, in whom we trust, that he will yet deliver us. Now I want you to think about that. He has done it, he is doing it, and we trust that he will do it. There's the attitude David had. God, you've sheltered me in the past, you're sheltering me at the present, and I trust that you're going to shelter me yet into the future. That's the kind of confidence that he had and the kind of confidence that we ought to have as well. Now the only way that Absalom could dethrone David was to dethrone God. Because David had put himself in God's hands. And as long as God was on the throne, God could keep David on the throne. You would have to dethrone God to get rid of David. And David was trusting in God, knowing that Absalom or no one else could dethrone God. And so he was trusting God to protect him. But let's notice the final point. And that is that his soul, it was well with his soul because his soul was supported. Take a look at verse 8. My soul followeth hard after thee. Thy right hand upholdeth me. Now, David's enemies were pursuing him hard. They were hot on his heels. They were following as closely as they possibly could to him. David said, I'm following just as hard after God. I'm staying just as close as I can to God because God's my protection. And as long as I can keep with God and my companionship is with God, I'm going to be okay. And so he was following hard after God. Now, this very word is used in the story of Ruth. Do you remember in the story of Ruth that we're told concerning Ruth that Ruth clave unto her mother-in-law? The idea there is she followed hard after her mother-in-law. She stayed right there with her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law couldn't leave her. Her mother-in-law said, you go back with... No, Ruth said, I'm not going back. I'm staying with you. And you can just imagine, Ruth's just right there with her. And Naomi can't outrun her. Naomi can't shake her. Ruth is there. She says, where you go, I'm going. Your people are my people. Your God's my God. I'm going with you. There's the image here. Do you remember in Genesis 32, in verses 26 through 28, that we have Jacob wrestling with the angel? Remember that picture? And it begins to be the breaking of the day. And this angel is ready to go. And Jacob won't turn loose. Now, this being is strong enough to merely touch Jacob and knock his hip out of socket. Pretty strong. But here is Jacob holding on for dear life. There's the idea here of following hard, the idea of cleaving, not letting something go. That's what David says. I've got a hold of God and I'm not letting Him go. I'm following hard after Him. I'm cleaving to Him. Luke 13 and verse 24 says that we must strive to enter into heaven because many will try and will not be able to enter. Talks about the effort that's involved in that. Do you remember in Luke chapter 18 in verses 5 through 7 that we have the persistent widow? Here's the widow that just keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming and keeps coming, and every time you turn around she's there. And you remember that her request was granted because she was so persistent. There's the image here is persistence. David says, I'm following after God. Every day I follow Him. Every day I stay just as close to Him as I can. I'm persistent. And he's convinced that God will grant his request. God will give him what he needs because he follows so hard after Him. How closely are you following God? Isaiah 59, 1 and 2 says that our sins and our iniquities separate us from God, and so there are some who God's not even in sight anymore. There's such a great gulf that's between them and God because of sin. That wasn't true of David. David says, I'm right there with God. And it is the image, when we talk about this support, it says, Thy right hand upholdeth me. When we say that he was following hard after God, and we define that as cleaving to God, we've got God's right hand, as it were, wrapped around David, upholding David. David's tired. David is running. And David says, God's got His arm around me. God's upholding me. God's going to keep me up. God's going to keep me going. Beautiful picture. We sing that song, right? We sing, underneath are the what? The everlasting arms. I know that some of us, me included, have some issues with the idea of my God and I. And walk and talk as good friends should and do. And I understand what our issues are with that. But you look at this psalm, and you look at what David's saying about God. And he is saying, God and I are walking side by side. And God is upholding me, and God's helping me. And I know, we're not trying to bring God down to our level. I don't want to do that. You don't want to do that either. But I am suggesting that we need to have the kind of relationship with God that David's talking about right here. And it is a close relationship. The Lord is my shepherd. You look at this psalm and other psalms and how he talks about their relationship in a very personal way. Now, it's not a sacrilegious kind of way, and it isn't an irreverent kind of way, but it is a very, very close fashion. So I just want you to think about that. It's a beautiful picture here. Thank you for your attention tonight.